I still remember that Tuesday night clearly. It was 9:15. I was sitting at my chipped kitchen table in a rented flat in Surrey. I had my laptop open to Rightmove, endlessly refreshing a search radius I could barely tolerate. I clicked on a listing for a ground floor 2-bedroom flat with visible damp in the corner of the living room photo. The asking price was £425,000. I looked at my savings account. I had a £40,000 deposit sitting there. I had spent 6 years eating packed lunches, skipping holidays, and living like a student to save it. What I did not know at the time was that even with 40 grand, I was mathematically further away from affording a home than when I started saving. And that is the moment everything changed for me. My name is Liam, and I spend way too much time obsessing over the invisible math of the United Kingdom housing market. If you are someone who feels like you are failing at life because you do not own a home yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today, I am not talking about cutting out coffee to save a bigger deposit. I want to talk about the exact mathematical formula that proves why renting forever might actually make you wealthier than buying. And I know it because I have been exactly where you are standing right now. I was 29 years old. I was earning £45,000 a year as a marketing manager. If you ask my parents, I was doing well. But every time I looked at a property portal, I felt like an absolute failure. Every single month, my rent took a massive chunk of my take-home pay. My take-home pay after taxes and student loans was roughly £2,700 a month. My rent was £1,200. That left me £1,500 for council tax, bills, food, transport, and trying to save for this impossible deposit. I was terrified. I was just throwing money into a void. Everyone around me was saying the exact same thing. Rent is dead money. You are just paying your landlord to get rich. Get on the property ladder at any cost. So I believed them. I became obsessed with the ladder. I tracked my savings on a spreadsheet every Sunday. I calculated exactly how much I could borrow based on my £45,000 salary. The bank told me I could borrow roughly 4.5 times my income. That meant a maximum mortgage of £202,500. Add my £40,000 deposit. That gave me a maximum buying power of £242,500. Then I looked back at the damp flat on Rightmove. £425,000. I was nearly £200,000 short, and property prices were rising faster than I could save. I realized I was running a race where the finish line was actively sprinting away from me. I sat back in my chair and felt completely defeated. I thought the system was broken. I thought I was locked out of building wealth forever because I did not have wealthy parents to hand me 100 grand. But I am a numbers guy. So instead of just giving up, I decided to open a blank spreadsheet and map out the exact lifetime cost of owning that damp flat versus renting my current place forever. I thought I was just doing an exercise to torture myself. I expected the math to show me how much money I was losing by renting. I expected to see millions of pounds of lost wealth. Instead, the numbers looking back at me did not make any sense. The spreadsheet told me that buying that flat would actually make me poorer over a 25-year timeline. And when I finally understood why, I realized the entire British dream of homeownership is hiding a massive financial illusion. I did not have a name for it back then. When I finally went looking, I found out it was called the property ladder trap. I had been calling it the impossible game for years. Turns out it already had a name. The concept hit me when I started digging into how wealth is actually built. I was tired of listening to my older relatives talk about how their houses had tripled in value since 1998. I needed real math. One night, I came across a 2024 housing market analysis by the wealth management firm Schroders. I used to think that buying a house was an absolute guarantee of wealth creation. I thought property always beat everything else. Then I found the data in that Schroders report showing that over the last 20 years, a globally diversified stock portfolio outperformed United Kingdom property price growth by roughly 4% a year on average. I read that twice. The stock market beat the housing market, and it was not even close. That 4% difference might sound small, but compounded over decades, it is the difference between an ordinary retirement and actual financial freedom. But at 29 years old, I was not thinking about generational wealth. I was just trying to get on the bottom rung. This brings me to the first layer of the property ladder trap. At first, I only saw this part, and I thought I understood it. The trap starts with the deposit. I told you I had £40,000 saved. To get that money, I sacrificed my 20s. I lived in a shared house with 4 other people until I was 27. I drove a 10-year-old car that rattled when I hit 40 miles an hour. I put every spare pound into a cash savings account, earning roughly 2% interest. I thought I was doing the right thing. But while my £40,000 was creeping up by £800 a year in interest, that damp flat on Rightmove was going up in price by £10,000 a year. The first layer of the trap is the belief that saving cash to buy an appreciating asset is a fair race. It is not. Cash loses value to inflation every single day. Property prices historically rise with inflation or faster. I was running on foot while the finish line was in a sports car. My £40,000 felt like a massive achievement. But in the reality of the Southeast property market, it was dead weight. It was not invested in the global economy. It was trapped in a holding pattern. I was sacrificing my current quality of life to hoard cash for a deposit on a property I could not even afford. I realized that by trying to buy a house, I was accidentally making myself poorer in real terms. The money I was desperately hoarding was losing its purchasing power month after month. I looked at my spreadsheet. I saw exactly what my deposit was doing. It was doing nothing. But that was just the deposit phase. I thought the math would automatically get better once I actually owned the property. I thought the pain of saving would be erased by the joy of building equity. But when I pushed past the deposit and dug into the actual monthly costs of owning that £425,000 flat, I found something much heavier. At first, I only saw the obvious part, the mortgage payment itself. But that was just the beginning of the math. At first, I only saw this part. And I thought I understood it. I knew. A mortgage was a big commitment. Most people know it. But I kept trying to force the numbers to work anyway. Let me walk you through the exact math I did that Tuesday night on a £400,000 flat in Surrey. I looked at the photos again. The kitchen cabinets were peeling. The carpets were a depressing shade of brown. But I desperately wanted to be on the ladder. I had my £40,000 deposit. That is exactly 10%. That meant I needed a mortgage for the remaining £360,000. I went to a banking website and opened a mortgage calculator. I punched in a standard interest rate of 5% over a 30-year term. I hit calculate. The monthly repayment staring back at me was £1,932. I used to think that a mortgage payment was always cheaper than rent because landlords had to make a profit. Then I found a 2023 report from Halifax Bank showing that for first-time buyers in the southeast of England, the monthly cost of owning a home was actually hundreds of pounds higher than renting the exact same property. I read that twice. The absolute foundation of British financial advice was the idea that buying is always cheaper than renting. But for my generation, in my region, it was mathematically false. People were willingly paying a massive premium just to say they owned the bricks. My rent at the time was £1,200 a month. The mortgage for a comparable flat was £1,932. That is a difference of £732 every single month. Remember my take-home pay, £2,700 a month. If I somehow got approved for that massive loan, my mortgage alone would eat over 70% of my net income. That would leave me with just £768 a month. From that tiny amount, I had to pay council tax, gas and electric bills, water, internet, food, and the train ticket to my job. I ran a quick household budget on my spreadsheet. After basic survival expenses, I would have £0 left over at the end of the month. Literally zero. I would be technically a homeowner, but I would be a prisoner in my own living room. I would never be able to afford a pint with my mates, take a cheap flight to Spain, or put away cash for emergencies. I was looking at being completely house poor. This is the first layer of the trap. We are taught to look at rent as throwing money away, so we stretch ourselves to the absolute breaking point to secure a mortgage. We ignore the massive gap in monthly cash flow because we believe we are building equity. We tell ourselves that at least the money is going into our own pockets. I stared at the £1,932 monthly payment on my screen. I tried hard to justify it. I told myself that a large chunk of that payment was just paying down my own debt. I told myself it was a forced savings account. But when I dug deeper, I found something that most people never notice. I looked at the amortization schedule of that 30-year loan. I looked at where my money was actually going during those first 5 to 10 years. And that is when the forced savings argument completely fell apart. Because the truth about what you are actually paying for is much worse. But when I dug deeper, I found something that most people never notice. I had always assumed that every mortgage payment was a direct deposit into my own future wealth. I thought paying rent was the only way to throw money away. Before I even made my first mortgage payment, I had to pay the entry fees to the property ladder. I started adding up the extra costs of buying that £400,000 flat in Surrey. Conveyancing fees for the solicitor were £2,000. A property survey to make sure the damp was not structural cost another £800. Mortgage arrangement fees and land registry fees added another £2,000. That was £4,800 just to get the keys. That money vanishes immediately. It does not go into equity. It is just the cost of doing business. But here is the part that completely broke my brain. I looked at the amortization schedule for my £360,000 loan at 5% interest over 30 years. My monthly payment was £1,932. I wanted to see how much of my first payment actually went toward owning the flat. Out of that £1,932, exactly £1,500 went straight to the bank as interest. Only £432 actually paid down my debt. I was paying £1,500 a month just to rent the money from the bank. I used to think that a mortgage was just a forced savings account where every penny built my net worth. Then I found a 2022 analysis by the Financial Conduct Authority showing that over the first 5 years of a standard 30-year mortgage, roughly 75% of your total payments go entirely toward interest. I read that twice. The vast majority of the money you sweat and bleed to pay every month during those early years is literally evaporating. It is the exact same thing as rent. You are just renting capital from a bank instead of a building from a landlord. I looked back at my own living situation. My actual rent at the time was £1,200 a month. The unrecoverable interest payment to the bank on the new flat was £1,500 a month. By buying the flat, I was not escaping dead money. I was actually increasing my dead money by £300 every single month. I was paying the bank more to rent their money than I was paying my landlord to rent a physical roof over my head. And here is the catch. Most first-time buyers do not stay in their first flat for 30 years. They move after 5 to 7 years to a bigger house, which means they sell right when the interest payments are at their absolute highest. They take all the upfront costs, pay maximum interest, and then restart the cycle all over again. Over the first 5 years of owning that flat, I would pay £115,920 in total mortgage payments. But my actual ownership in the property would only increase by roughly £30,000. The other £85,000 was gone forever. The bank kept it. Add the £4,800 in upfront buying fees. That is nearly £90,000 of unrecoverable costs in just 5 years. £90,000 of pure evaporated wealth. I sat at my kitchen table looking at that number. I thought that was the worst of it. I thought the unrecoverable costs stopped with the bank. But the trap goes deeper, and this is the part that took me years to figure out. The part nobody tells you about the true cost of bricks and mortar. And this is the part that took me years to figure out. The part nobody tells you. I am talking about the maintenance illusion. When you rent, your monthly payment is the absolute maximum you will ever pay for housing. If the boiler explodes on a Sunday night, you make one phone call. Your landlord pays for it. Your rent stays exactly the same. You are buying predictability. When you buy, your mortgage payment is the absolute minimum you will ever pay for housing. Everything else is on you. I used to think that once you bought a house, your monthly payments were fixed forever, and you were completely safe from surprise bills. Then I found a 2023 report from the Office for National Statistics showing that the average United Kingdom homeowner spends over £3,500 a year just maintaining their property. I read that twice. £3,500 a year, just to keep the physical structure from falling apart. In the property world, they call it the 1% rule. The rule says you should expect to spend roughly 1% of the total value of your home on maintenance every single year. For that £400,000 flat I was looking at on Rightmove, 1% is £4,000 a year. That breaks down to roughly £333 every single month in hidden costs. Let me tell you about my mate Ben. Ben is exactly my age. He bought a 2-bedroom terrace house for £380,000. He felt like a king. He told me I was throwing my money away on rent. 6 months after he moved in, his boiler completely died. We live in the United Kingdom. You cannot survive November without a working boiler. He had to pay £3,200 out of pocket to get it replaced immediately. 8 months later, a massive winter storm hit. The roof started leaking directly into his second bedroom, ruining the ceiling and the carpet. The repair bill was £4,500. In his first 14 months of homeownership, Ben spent £7,700 on emergency repairs. But Ben had wiped out his entire savings account to pay his deposit and his solicitor fees. He did not have £7,700 sitting in cash. So he had to put the roof repair on a credit card charging 22% annual interest. Remember that amortization schedule we talked about earlier? I showed you how in the first few years, you are barely paying off any of your actual debt. Over those same 14 months, Ben had only paid down roughly £5,000 of his mortgage principal. His house had just consumed £7,700 in unexpected cash. He had literally lost more money fixing the physical bricks than he had built in financial equity. The house was eating his wealth. And now he was paying 22% interest on top of his mortgage just to keep the rain out. When Ben told me this over a pint, he looked completely exhausted. He was working weekend overtime just to pay off the credit card. He was technically on the property ladder, but he was trapped in a cycle of constant financial anxiety. He was working for his house, not the other way around. I went back to my kitchen table and opened my spreadsheet. I added that hidden £333 a month for maintenance to my projected mortgage cost. My unrecoverable interest payment to the bank was £1,500 a month. My estimated maintenance cost was £333 a month. That was £1,833 vanishing into thin air every single month. Pure sunk cost. My rent was only £1,200 a month. By renting, I was mathematically saving £633 a month in dead money. I was the one coming out ahead. But this was still just looking at the money going out the door. I had only calculated how to stop the bleeding. I had not even looked at the money I could be making. I had this £40,000 deposit sitting in cash. I needed to know what would happen if I stopped trying to buy a damp flat and started buying the global economy instead. When I finally ran the 25-year timeline side by side, the final number was so large I thought I had broken the spreadsheet. I opened a new tab on my spreadsheet. I wanted to see the final score after 25 years. I wanted to map out my entire financial life side by side. Path 1 was the British dream. I buy the £400,000 flat. I hand over my £40,000 deposit. I pay my £1,932 mortgage every single month. I pay my £333 in average monthly maintenance. My total monthly housing cost is £2,265. Let us assume the property market stays healthy. Let us say my flat rises in value by a solid 3% every year. After 25 years, I own the property outright. The mortgage is gone. My flat is now worth roughly £837,000. That sounds amazing. That sounds like winning the game. But then I built Path 2. Path 2 was the renter strategy. I stay in my current flat. I keep paying my landlord £1,200 a month. Because my rent is so much cheaper than the total cost of owning, I have £1,065 left over every month. I do not buy a new car. I do not inflate my lifestyle. I take that initial £40,000 deposit and I put it straight into a low-cost global index fund. Then I take that £1,065 of monthly savings and I invest it into the exact same fund every single month for 25 years. I used to think that a paid-off house was the only guaranteed way to build £1 million. Then I found a 2023 long-term asset return study from Barclays showing that over the last 5 decades, global stocks historically returned roughly 8% a year on average. I read that twice. The global stock market was historically doubling invested money roughly every 9 years. Property was not even coming close. So I plugged that 8% average return into my spreadsheet. I hit enter. I watched the numbers populate. After 10 years, the math started to split. My invested deposit and my monthly contributions had grown to roughly £275,000 in liquid cash. Meanwhile, if I had bought the flat, I would still owe the bank over £280,000 in debt. After 20 years, the gap became a canyon. My investment account crossed £750,000, and then we hit year 25, the final finish line. If I bought the flat, I had an illiquid brick box worth £837,000. I could not buy groceries with it. I could not easily access the wealth. If I wanted that money, I had to sell my home, pay thousands in estate agent fees, and find somewhere else to live. If I rented and invested the difference, my stock portfolio was worth exactly £1.3 million. £1.3 million. By choosing to rent, I was nearly £500,000 richer, and every single penny of that wealth was perfectly liquid. I could log into my brokerage account and sell a tiny slice of it on a Tuesday morning to pay for a holiday. I could not sell a single brick of my damp flat to buy a plane ticket. I stared at the screen. The numbers were absolute. Renting was not throwing money away. Renting was buying the flexibility to invest in the actual global economy. I had spent my entire adult life feeling like a failure for paying rent, and the whole time, the very system I was trying to escape was mathematically superior. But realizing the math on a spreadsheet is one thing. Living it in the real world is another. Because when I closed my laptop and looked around, I realized the numbers did not matter to anyone else. That was when I finally understood why I kept getting stuck even when I knew the right answer. I was fighting a cultural religion. In the United Kingdom, homeownership is not just a financial decision. It is the ultimate measure of adult success. I realized my obsession with buying that damn flat had nothing to do with building wealth. It was about buying status. I wanted to be able to stand at a pub on a Friday night and say I owned a place. I wanted my parents to stop giving me that slightly worried look every time my lease was up for renewal. The psychological pressure is absolute. Every time I opened a newspaper or turned on the television, someone was talking about getting on the property ladder. They call it a ladder on purpose. It implies that if you are renting, you are standing in the dirt at the bottom. I used to think the pressure to buy was just my own personal insecurity. Then I found a 2023 survey by the Homeowners Alliance, showing that 85% of renters in the United Kingdom feel a deep sense of failure because they do not own property. I read that twice. 8 out of 10 people view renting as a personal failure. We have entirely linked our self-worth to holding a massive debt contract with a high street bank. This is the psychological dimension of the trap, and the financial industry knows exactly how to exploit it. Banks and mortgage brokers sell us the feeling of security. They sell us the dream of painting our own walls and hanging our own pictures. And in exchange, we willingly hand over the next 30 years of our economic output. The system actively encourages this exact panic. I started looking at government initiatives designed to help first-time buyers. They are entirely designed to pump more borrowed money into the housing market under the disguise of helping young people. They do not lower house prices. They just trap more of us in massive debt earlier in our lives. The whole system relies on my generation throwing our life savings at the bottom rung so the older generation can cash out at the top. I realized I was just being used as liquidity for someone else's retirement. I remember going to a family dinner right around the time I was doing this math. My uncle sat across the table from me. He bought his 4-bedroom house for £40,000 in the 1980s. It is now worth £900,000. He looked at me and asked when I was going to stop making my landlord rich and finally settle down. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. I wanted to explain my spreadsheet. I wanted to tell him about unrecoverable costs and the historical returns of the global stock market, but I knew it would not matter. Because you cannot invite your family over to look at your index fund. You cannot host a summer barbecue on a dividend yield. Property is a physical monument to your success. A brokerage account is just invisible numbers on a screen. That is why we ignore the math. We are socially conditioned to prefer a visible, expensive trap over invisible, mathematical freedom. We will happily lock ourselves into a cycle of stress and maintenance just to avoid the stigma of being a lifelong renter. I walked home from that family dinner feeling completely isolated. I knew the math was right. I knew renting and investing the difference would make me richer. But the cultural programming was so deep that I still felt like I was making a massive mistake. And I understand exactly what you are thinking right now. You are looking at my spreadsheet math and finding the fatal flaw in my argument. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now. Because it used to form in mine. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now. Because it used to form in mine. I know this sounds unrealistic. I pushed back against this idea for years. You are listening to my spreadsheet math and thinking about the obvious flaw. You are thinking that renting is literally just paying someone else's mortgage. You are thinking that at the end of 25 years of renting, I have 0 bricks. I own absolutely nothing, and my landlord can kick me out at any moment. I understand exactly what you are thinking right now. I thought the exact same thing. Every time I transferred 1,200 pounds to my landlord, I felt physically sick. I felt like I was funding someone else's retirement while destroying my own. I thought that buying a house, even with all the interest and fees and endless maintenance, was the only way to guarantee a roof over my head when I got old. But then I had to ask myself what ownership actually means. I had to look at the reality of holding property long term. I used to think that once you paid off your mortgage, your housing was finally free. Then I found a 2024 report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies looking at the real baseline cost of homeownership in later life. I read that report twice. It showed that even after the mortgage is completely paid off, the average retired household in the United Kingdom still spends roughly £4,000 a year just on council tax, home insurance, and essential structural maintenance. Housing is never free. Even when you own the bricks outright, the house is a constant, unavoidable drain on your cash flow. This is the counterintuitive truth that finally rewired my brain. You are always renting. You either rent from a landlord, or you rent money from a bank through mortgage interest. Or once the house is paid off, you rent from the local council through taxes and from the plumber through emergency repairs. The goal is not to stop paying for housing. You will always pay for housing. The actual goal of personal finance is to build the largest pile of liquid capital possible so that paying for housing becomes completely effortless. When I rent, yes, I am technically paying my landlord's mortgage, but my landlord's capital is permanently trapped in that physical flat. If he needs £50,000 tomorrow, he cannot access it without selling the entire property and paying massive estate agent fees. My capital is completely free. My £40,000 deposit is out in the global market. It is buying shares of the most profitable companies on earth. My money is compounding daily while my landlord is answering my angry phone calls about a leaking washing machine. I finally understood that capital allocation is the real game. Stacking bricks is a terrible way to allocate capital. Once I let go of the emotional need to own a house, the anxiety completely vanished. But knowing the math is useless unless you actually change your behavior. I had to build a system that made this renter strategy work in the real world. The first thing I did was entirely change how I looked at my monthly paycheck. The first thing I did was completely accept the weight of my decision. Walking away from the property ladder meant I had to become my own bank. I realized that if I was going to rent forever, I had to treat my investments with the exact same respect that society treats a mortgage payment. I could not just save whatever happened to be left over at the end of the month. I had to force the math to work. The first step I took was deploying my trapped capital. Moving £40,000 into the stock market felt terrifying at first. I had spent 6 years carefully protecting that money. But I took a deep breath and transferred it out of my 2% cash savings account. I opened a stocks and shares individual savings account. In the United Kingdom, you can put up to £20,000 a year into this specific account, and you never pay tax on the growth or the dividends. I transferred £20,000 into the tax-free account immediately. I put the remaining £20,000 into a standard general investment account, planning to move it over the following tax year. I bought a low-cost global equity index fund. I stopped hoarding cash that was losing value to inflation, and I actually bought a slice of the global economy. The second step I took was automating the difference between renting and buying. Remember my spreadsheet. The total unrecoverable cost of owning that flat, between the interest and the average maintenance, was £1,833 a month. My rent was £1,200. That gave me a mathematical advantage of £633 every single month. I did not just leave that £633 in my current account. I knew my own human nature. I knew I would just spend it on random upgrades to my lifestyle. So I set up a direct and automatic transfer. Every single month, the morning after my salary hits my bank account, £633 automatically transfers straight into my investment portfolio. I treat that transfer exactly like a legal debt obligation to a bank. I cannot skip it. I cannot negotiate it. It is a hard, fixed cost of living. But instead of paying a high street bank for the privilege of holding a 30-year debt, I am paying my own future self for the privilege of buying actual freedom. The first sign of escape was almost entirely mental. I deleted the property apps from my phone. I stopped spending my Tuesday nights looking at depressing flats in Surrey. I stopped feeling a heavy knot in my stomach when my friends talked about their solicitors, their rising interest rates, or their sudden roof repairs. Then the mathematical signs of escape started showing up. 6 months after I started this new system, I checked my investment account. The global market had experienced a solid run. My original £40,000, combined with my strict monthly contributions, had grown to just over £46,000. My money had actually earned more while I was sleeping than I had previously managed to save. In an entire year of scraping pennies and eating packed lunches. And the absolute best part was that my living situation was completely stress-free. When the washing machine broke down in my rented flat in month 8, I did not have a financial panic attack. I just sent a quick email to my landlord. He paid £350 to replace the machine the very next day. My investment portfolio was completely untouched by the emergency. I was running my alternative path perfectly, but I still had to figure out how this system was going to protect me when I was 65 years old and no longer had a salary to pay rent. Because getting to retirement without a paid-off house is the part that scares people the most. Let me show you exactly how the final stage of the math works out. The third step I took was building a permanent defense against rent increases and old age. The biggest fear of renting forever is being priced out when you no longer have a salary. But I had to look at the math of what my portfolio would actually do over my entire working life. I was 29 years old when I started this plan. I wanted to retire at 65. That gave me exactly 36 years for my money to compound. I had my initial £40,000 invested in the market. I had my automatic monthly transfer of £633. I assumed that historical average return of roughly 8% a year. I ran those exact numbers on my spreadsheet. I wanted to see my absolute final score at retirement. After 36 years of disciplined renting and investing, my liquid net worth would sit at roughly £2.1 million. £2.1 million in completely liquid, globally diversified assets. Then I compared that to the alternative. If I had bought that damp flat and stayed on the property ladder, my paid-off house might be worth around £1.5 million by the time I was 65. But I could not buy groceries with a brick. I would be completely asset-rich and cash-poor. I would be sitting in a very expensive house, worrying about how to pay for my winter heating bill. I would probably have to sell the house, pay thousands to an estate agent, and downsize to a smaller flat anyway just to free up cash. With my renter strategy, I did not have to sell anything. I applied the standard 4% safe withdrawal rate to my portfolio. The math says you can safely withdraw 4% of a globally diversified portfolio every year in retirement without ever running out of money. 4% of £2.1 million is £84,000 a year. I looked at that number and smiled. £84,000 a year in purely passive income. Even factoring in decades of inflation and rising property costs, £84,000 a year is more than enough to rent a beautiful place, travel, and live comfortably. And I would never have to fix a broken boiler, replace a leaking roof, or pay thousands in sudden maintenance bills. My liquid wealth would just pay my rent effortlessly. The final step I took was simply letting go of the guilt. I had to stop apologizing to my family for not buying a house. I had to stop feeling like a failure when someone younger than me posted a photo with a new set of house keys. I realized that the property ladder trap is only a trap if you agree to play the game. The moment you step off the ladder, the financial pressure completely disappears. I am not saying buying a house is always wrong. If you want to plant roots, if you want to knock down walls, and if you are perfectly happy paying the unrecoverable costs to a bank for that privilege, then buying is fine. It is a valid lifestyle choice. But it is a lifestyle choice. It is not the ultimate mathematical foundation of wealth. Once I accepted that, I got my entire life back. I stopped working overtime just to hoard dead cash. I stopped living in fear of a damp flat in Surrey. I bought my freedom with a spreadsheet instead of a massive mortgage. If this video helped you see your finances differently, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe. Every video I make is something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.